Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt. We turn now in our study of Leaves of Grass to Children of Adam, and especially I Sing the Body Electric. This is section number 3, sometimes referred to as the Great Patriarch section. Now, we are assuming that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down the left-hand side, Talks with Walt, and that you've been with us from the inscriptions lectures all the way through, starting from Pomanak to Song of Myself, and then finally the Children of Adam poems. My hope is that you've already followed with us I Sing the Body Electric sections 1 and 2. Certainly the introductory information as we turn now to passage number 3. Now put this in your notes right away, and you can put this at 2b. Notice that Whitman does this often, where he'll move from the general down to the very, very specific. In the preceding section, section number 2, he's going to describe any number of people that he admires. But it's more in the general, right? It's just a couple of boys wrestling, or a guy swimming, or whatever. Now all of a sudden, we're going to get very specific. And we can, of course, read this as a singular example of the great man, as Emerson and Carlyle will talk about him, or he can obviously be symptomatic of a certain kind of a strong American that Whitman will celebrate. I knew a man, a common farmer, the father of 5 sons, and in them the fathers of sons, and in them the fathers of sons. This man was a wonderful vigor, calmness, beauty of person, the shape of his head, the pale yellow and white of his hair and beard, the immeasurable meaning of his black eyes, the richness and breadth of his manners. These I used to go and visit him to see. He was wise also. He was 6 feet tall. He was over 80 years old. His sons were massive, clean, bearded, tan-faced, handsome. They and his daughters loved him. All who saw him loved him. They didn't love him by allowance. They loved him with personal love. He drank water only. The blood showed like scarlet through the clear brown skin of his face. He was a frequent gunner and fisher. He sailed his boat himself. He had a fine one presented to him by a ship joiner. He had fowling pieces presented to him by men that loved him. When he went with his 5 sons and many grandsons to hunt or fish, you could pick him out as the most beautiful and vigorous of the game. You would wish long and long to be with him. You would wish to sit by him in the boat, that you and he might touch each other. Now, there's been a lot of debate about who specifically this man is, and is it possible that maybe this is an amalgamation or an ideal? We're going to go ahead and bypass all of that speculation and go right quickly to the fact that we begin with first person and end with second person. Notice, he'll start with I knew this man, I saw this. And then finally, by the end of this little poem, he's going to invite you to say you would want to be next to him so that there could be some kind of contact or touching. Notice he began, first of all, by talking about a man he once knew. I knew a man, and then he calls him a common farmer, and this will be a celebration of the common that we're going to see all the way through Leaves of Grass. The father of 5 sons. Now, it's interesting because, as we've said in earlier lectures, Whitman had a very interesting relationship with his own father. His own father was a man of some complexity and some serious problems. Definitely not the ideal father that this man clearly is. So that's being juxtaposed. Notice we got 5 sons, and the numbering here is biblical in its understandings. I'll let you go ahead and run that one to ground. And in them, he says, the fathers of sons, and in them the fathers of sons. In other words, it's all about legacy. It's all about genealogy, isn't it, right? This man was a wonderful vigor, and this will take us back to what's referenced about Moses at the end of the book of Deuteronomy and the fact that he was a man of great vigor. I'm just going to point out here that for Whitman, it's clear that what matters is this is a man of great, great energy, right? As well, not just vigor, calmness, beauty of person. So in other words, he's physically, he's very attractive. The shape of his head, that's an interesting study in itself, because Whitman lived in a time when doctors were saying increasingly that from the shape of your head we can tell a whole lot about you. Obviously, Most of that science is debunked today, but Whitman took it pretty seriously. The pale yellow and white of his hair, I told you, Whitman and hair. As we've already said, just type in Google Whitman and photographs of Whitman, and then just look at all of the pictures of Whitman. He had white hair. Whitman looked like an old man by the time he was 30. And he had this amazing head of hair, and so he celebrates it here in his ideal as well. Notice he says the white of his hair and beard. I told you about beards, right, all the way back to Song of Myself, passage 5, and everywhere else in between. The immeasurable meaning of his black eyes. It's interesting that they're black. They're not blue, they're not green. Black eyes. The richness and breadth of his manners. This seems to suggest that maybe he has a certain kind of culture. Now, for Whitman, this is the ideal American. He can go out and hunt and fish and do all of those things, but he's also very, very cultured as well. We can think, obviously, about the contemporary of Whitman, Thoreau, in this regards, right? These, he says, I used to go and visit him to see. In other words, Whitman says, this was a man I loved to just be in his presence, right, and be around him. He was wise also. So here we are with our Plato, right? In other words, he evinces all of the cardinal virtues, doesn't he? Of wisdom and courage, and obviously some temperance. We're going to get to that one. Discipline, as well as, of course, justice. And the fact that he's loved because of all of this, right? He was wise also. And then he tells us he was 6 feet tall. In other words, he carries a presence about him, right? He was over 80 years old, which will explain that he has sons and grandsons and even great-grandsons, right? 80 years old. His sons, now we're going to hear about them. Massive, that is to say, well-built. Clean. That's interesting that that word gets used. We're going to see this several times in Whitman, where he will say that he celebrates cleanliness, okay? And of course, hygiene in the 1850s is not what today we think of as hygiene and the whole thing of staying clean. So here it is. Clean. We're back to beards again. Bearded, the sons. Tan-faced. We're coming back to beauty and handsomeness as well. They and his daughters. Notice the repetition of the word love to show that this is a man that was revered, that was loved. They and his daughters loved him. All who saw him loved him. They did not love him by allowance. In other words, they were complete in their love. They loved him with personal love. In other words, he related to everyone in ways that made him truly beloved by all. Then we're told a little bit about, and now this will be some of Whitman as well. Remember, I told you he was part of that temperance movement. Whitman had some real concern about alcohol and the consumption of alcohol. Notice here, he drinks water only. Okay, the blood showed like scarlet through the clear brown skin of his face. We're back to celebration of the face. Then we're told of some of the things that he loved to do, especially he's an outdoorsman, right? He was a frequent gunner, hunter, and fisher. He loved to fish. Notice we're told, much like Thoreau, right, a man of the outdoors, he's also self-reliant. He sailed his boat himself. He didn't need anybody to sail it for him. And then we're told in a very fine little kind of thing, little add-on, that he had a fine boat presented to him by a ship joiner. In other words, he was given a gift. He had fowling pieces. Now, we've mentioned this already about the use of firearms mentioned in Leaves of Grass. So here we are back to it again. Presented to him by men that loved him. In other words, in Whitman's day, if you want to show great admiration for a colleague or an individual, you might give him a gun, give him a firearm. And he says he got several of these, notice, from different men. In other words, he's revered and loved by a lot of men. When he went with his 5 sons and many grandsons to hunt or fish, notice the shift from I to you. You would pick him out as the most beautiful, and then we're back to vigorous again, of the gang. The fact that he uses the word gang makes us think about, I hear America singing at the end of those lines. You would wish long and long. That phrasing of long and long, by the way, notice it. You're going to hear it several times in Leaves of Grass. Long and long to be with him. You would wish to sit by him in the boat that you and he might touch each other. Now this idea of adhesivity, that thing of being adhesive, that idea of touching, that idea of being close in proximity to someone who you really revere, we've seen this already in Leaves of Grass. We will see more of it in Leaves of Grass. This is, of course, his celebration of what? Well, the ideal man. Who is the ideal man for Whitman? He's a man that's 80 years old, that has all kinds of family around him, that's incredibly beloved by everyone who meets him, And yet he's a self-sufficient man. He still goes out, he still does his hunting and his fishing. He's the ideal man. And here Whitman will celebrate him in passage 3 of I Sing the Body Electric. Let's just finish it to well, obviously one powerful example is all that one needs to be able to provide the exactitude of excellence, as he would say it, right? At 2b, notice again that we move from the first person, I knew this guy, to you would want to sit next to him in the boat, to the second person. At 3a, we've mentioned this before in other lectures. I think there's a lot of Carlyle and Emerson going on here. That what we call great man theory, that notion that it's a certain number of individuals. We call it great man, but obviously it would be great man, great woman theory, right? That is to say, a woman decides to not get up from a bus seat and look at what happens. There are individuals in history that have a tremendous influence and effect. The other place I want to go is Homer, because the celebration of this kind of man will take us back to our Iliad. Go back and look at the Iliad and the ways in which certain kinds of individuals are going to be celebrated by virtue of the fact that they have sons who have sons. In other words, that whole legacy thing, right? Obviously, we think about Odysseus and Telemachus when we think about this kind of thing. And, of course, Laertes, that is to say, the father, who's the great progenitor of all of that. Go back to those end lines of the Odyssey. We've given full lectures on all of this. I like to think as well as the contemporary Melville and the way that he will describe Ahab in some similar kinds of ways. Strong, very dynamic, this word vigorous, lots of energy and the like. Finally, at 3b, as a way to kind of own a passage like this, it's a self-evident question. Who do you celebrate out of your own existence in your own life that's similar, that makes you say, oh, I knew somebody kind of like this, that by the time they were in old age, they were still unbelievably respected, loved, and revered. Well, there you go. Passage 3. It's like an amazing little snapshot from I Sing the Body Electric that makes you think about maybe someone you revere and love as well. Thank you.